Welcome to the Scholarly Research Committee 2024 Spring Webinar. It is sponsored by ACRL and Community and Junior College Libraries section. I am Christine Kim, co-chair of the Scholarly Research Committee. This year's webinar focuses on DEI research and assessment. The webinar will be recorded and posted to the ACRL YouTube channel and the Scholarly Research Committee LibGuides. You will receive a link to the video within 7 days after the webinar. We have 3 speakers today. Each has 15 minutes to present. At the end of 3 presentations, there will be a Q&A session. Please submit your questions to Q&A. Thank you again for joining us today. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Sherelle. She will introduce each speaker.
Hi, everyone. So today we have with us Dr. Kawanna Bright. She will be our first speaker. Dr. Kawanna Bright is an assistant professor of library science at East Carolina University. Her current research focuses on assessment in libraries, equity, diversity, and inclusion in libraries, the application of research methodology to the study of library and information science, and the liaison librarianship role in academic libraries. She'll be presenting Inclusive DEIA Library Assessment, the Value of Multiple Perspectives and Voices. Dr. Bright?
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Sherelle, thank you so much for the welcome and the introduction. For this presentation today, I wanted to focus on this idea of making sure that when we talk about DEIA assessment, that we're talking about it in terms of being inclusive. So I'm going to cover a little bit about DEI assessment, past, present, future, focus on internal versus external assessment, a little bit of insight about where to begin, some inclusive approaches, and then we're going to make sure we give some tips and takeaways. I have a little playlist for you all. So if we start talking about past, present, and future, if we think about DEIA assessment in the past, it was typically pretty limited, and we relied a lot on numerical data and focused on some very specific identities. Nothing wrong with that, but the focus wasn't as broad as it really needed to be to recognize that different identities existed and that all of those identities needed to work together within these organizations that we have. And then also we were very focused on our external populations, which most of us working in academic institutions, we need to be focused on those external populations. But there was also this lack of understanding about the impact of what happens inside of our organizations and how we need to make sure that the work we're doing internally also is going to impact the work that's happening externally. And if we're not aware of what's happening internally, then we're probably not aware of the negative impact on the external community as well. So if we think then about this idea of where we're at now, we do see a much more expanded approach to doing assessment for DEIA. We're definitely seeing more qualitative approaches that's been going on now for the last 15 years or so. And we're starting to recognize that we need to think about identities in an intersectional way and also think about different concepts when we think about what we mean by DEIA. And we're starting to recognize that our external stakeholders actually have important perspectives to add to the conversation and need to be considered as well. But then if we think about the future, what I'm expecting us to see is much more of this recognition that mixed methods should be the norm for the type of work we're actually doing. We should be collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. We should be looking at that data together and recognizing that one is going to help us understand the other. Also, this approach to doing community-based or community-engaged assessment, where we're not solely relying on individuals or one or two people to tell us what's really happening when we start thinking about DEIA. And then really the big deal is going to be making sure that this is built more directly into all our processes, our services, our programming, how we make decisions. If we're not integrating that into the process of development, then we're already missing out on the value of doing assessment. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think about focusing internal or externally. And really it's because there needs to be an understanding, and I've mentioned this already, but an understanding that what we do internally and who we are as an organization and as people working at organization impacts our external community and impacts what we do for our external communities. So I say, why not do both? Why make the decision that you're only going to do assessment either internally or externally for DEIA? When we're talking about internal, you definitely are looking at your employee demographics, but you're also looking at your employees' needs and their experiences. You're looking at your training, your education, your professional development. You're also looking at your policies and your practices. For external, we're looking at our community demographics and our community needs and experiences, and then also those policies and services and how they are impacting our external communities. So where to begin? That's the question most people ask me when I start talking about this type of assessment. And really, you start with the basics. So if you do not already have an assessment plan for your library, you need an assessment plan. And this is not even just a DEIA assessment plan. You need an assessment plan for your library for everything, but DEIA, of course, can be naturally built into that plan. And if you're creating this assessment plan, you're asking yourself the basic questions. You're asking who, what, when, where, and how. And then you consider, do we need to also do an organizational DEI assessment as more of a conversation starter? So I have an instrument that I do make available to all academic libraries who are interested in trying it out. I call it the DESA, it's the DEI-SAA. It was meant to be a self-assessment audit of DEI within academic libraries. And what we've learned from the instrument is that it allows you to start asking questions about whether or not you've put effort into doing DEIA in different parts of your organization. And it's turned into a great conversation starter for most academic libraries who have not had a chance to sit down and really think through, are we assessing, are we doing this work? And so asking yourself these questions and then going through this quick process of just almost like a checklist, are we engaging in this work, can be a great way to get started with the idea of where do we do the assessment for DEIA. I also have an idea for a 7-step assessment plan approach. And really this aligns with the idea of creating your assessment plan, but you do need to start with determining which aspect of DEIA you're going to assess. And what we mean by that is, are you going to look at diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility? Are you going to look at social justice, anti-racism? You need to make that determination first, because one of your next steps is going to be creating definitions, working definitions that you're going to use to understand what you're actually trying to assess and what you're looking for. Then figure out from there, what is the ultimate goal of your assessment? Are you assessing this for a specific reason? Is it for the overarching institution? Have they asked you for data? Is it because you're going to be requesting funding? Also, what's the anticipated impact of doing this assessment? And ultimately asking yourself, why are we even conducting this assessment? Do we need to do this type of assessment? Step 4 is determining who is actually going to do the work, which turns out to be the hardest question you typically have to ask. And then you determine what aspects of the library you're going to include in this assessment. And that's going to connect directly to the ultimate goal. You'll know specifically what aspects of your organization to assess based on your goal. Step 6 is determining how you're going to actually conduct your assessment. So are you going to do focus groups, interviews, surveys? Are you going to rely on existing data only? You're going to do a combination of all those things. And then finally, step 7 is actually create a timeline for yourselves and be logical and also be kind to yourselves. If you think about creating your timeline, you're not going to be able to accomplish everything in terms of DEI assessment in a few months. This is an ongoing process, and that timeline helps you to keep track of where you're at. So this idea of inclusive approaches, mostly this is just a reminder that we need to recognize that one person's story, one person's experience, one person's perspective is not going to be the end-all be-all of everything that's happening in a library, and especially not going to cover all the different identities that we have that exist, the different ideas and cultures and perspectives we have in our organizations. It's very limited. This is not to say it's not valuable. Every person's experience, every person's perspective is valuable, but you need to be able to collect all of those perspectives, excuse me, all those experiences together to get the total story. And so being inclusive in your process means inviting in everyone to engage in the process of assessment. This also brings in the benefits of collaboration and engagement. Asking one person or a very small group of people to do assessment in general is difficult. Asking them to do the DEIA assessment by themselves is made even more difficult because they may not have access or the ability to engage in that type of assessment by themselves. But if you actually have everyone working on this process, figuring out where their roles are and engaging, then you're more likely to be successful as well. And then also offering multiple ways for people to engage, not just assuming that only certain people are going to be engaged in focus groups or collecting data. Maybe some people want to mostly be engaged in finding the external community to communicate with or being the marketing piece. But there's different ways for people to engage in this process. And it doesn't have to be that you're only there to do one thing or have one role, and definitely not based on whatever your background is. So a few tips and takeaways, and I call this my playlist because I listen to way too much music and I have very eclectic taste, but these are just some of those things to remind ourselves of if you're going to engage in DEIA assessment in your academic library. So here's your playlist, and I'm not saying that you need to abide by the actual full lyrics of all these songs, as you'll see. It's probably not the best option, but especially for this idea of getting started, I'm going to give you Rage Against the Machine and Guerrilla Radio, because there's a line in there that says it has to start somewhere, it has to start sometime. What better place than here? What better time than now? And that's a reminder for us that you do need to get started. If you're not doing DEI assessment at all, you need to get started. And we tend to come up with a lot of excuses, a lot of barriers for why we don't do the work. You need to start somewhere. There's no better time than now. So go ahead and get started. The next song I'm going to give you is Lifehouse, You and Me. And this is your reminder to work inclusively, because it's you and me and it's all of the people. It's everyone else. We all need to be involved in this process. Everyone's voice needs to be heard, and they need to have that opportunity to be heard as well. And then make some choices, because you can't do it all. It's almost impossible to try to engage in every single aspect of DEI assessment. So I'm going to give you switch foot. I dare you to move, because you're always going to be kind of dealing with this tension between what you can do and what you can't do. And they're going to tell you there's this tension between who you are and who you could be, between how it is and how it should be. And especially talking about DEIA in our organizations, this is where we're often left with this little bit of tug and war. So I do dare you to move. I dare you to make some decisions and to go in that direction and just follow through. So that's going to be your last bit of your playlist, is to make sure you are following through on this process. So Gavin DeGraw, follow through, basically with everything you say. So if you're saying you're going to do something, make sure you do it. But that the main thing is that that's always going to be the start of something good, that we're always going to be able to say that we accomplished this because we took the time, we engaged in the work, and we followed through. The last part of that follow through is also to remind yourselves that don't just do the work and then not share it. You need to make sure people know what came out of all the efforts that they put into everything. That level of transparency is important as well. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking, because I know there's also two other fantastic people here who are also going to be more directly engaged in doing this type of assessment in the community college setting. And I'm excited to hear from them as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bright. We greatly appreciate it. I know that people are going to have questions. Our question and answer session is going to happen at the end once our panelists are finished. You can submit your Q&As to the Q&A section of the webinar. Next, we are going to be hearing from Elizabeth Godwin. Elizabeth Godwin is the Senior Director of Libraries at the Community College of Baltimore County. Her current research and professional work focuses on the community college library and undergraduate storytelling. We'll be hearing her presentation, Facilitating a Student-Driven Diversity Audit. Elizabeth?
Thank you. I am speaking to you today as a humble practitioner of the community college library arts and perhaps an aspiring researcher. Last year, I was working as the collection development coordinator for CCBC libraries, and emboldened by a presentation at ACRL in Pittsburgh, I launched one of the ever popular student-driven diversity audits of authors recently acquired works at our libraries. Conducting this type of reflective research only became feasible for us at a teaching institution when arranging it as an opportunity for high-impact original student research. This introduced an interesting element of the unknown, not just to the results, but the process itself. And this presentation is largely about how we went through that journey. The project was made possible by my open-minded Dean of Special Academic Programs at CCBC, who saw this research as valuable diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practice for the library, but also a unique opportunity for our novice scholars to engage in meaningful and complex research challenges as principal investigators. So we are a mid-sized institution in suburban Baltimore County, which surrounds the city of Baltimore, and our 3 main campuses are located around the port on the Chesapeake Bay. In the most recent fall semester, we had an FTE of 4,126 credit students, and like so many community colleges, we have a very diverse student body. This includes 30% first-generation students, 50% students over the age of 30, with a good number of international students and slightly more ethnic diversity than in Baltimore County itself. Next slide. This project was designed in part to suit available grant funding. With short notice, we were able to engage 2 student interns who were both on-campus honor students recommended by faculty. They both had an interest in social sciences and the humanities, and between them provided several perspectives on identity informed by their backgrounds and experience as independent or non-traditional students. Together, we met for an extended orientation at the library and discussed selected readings that had been provided in advance, including U.S. Census definitions and also more scholarly work about the value of inclusion and about diversity in community colleges. We talked about strategies for exploring these authors' backgrounds and lives for demographic and identity information. And finally, we arranged to meet weekly on Teams to discuss the questions that would inevitably arise. I worked with cataloging and metadata librarian to prepare a live shared spreadsheet of works written by a single author acquired in the last 5 years, which was only a time period selected to find recent acquisitions that might be representative enough to offset the financial impacts of the pandemic. Next slide. As the former collection development librarian, I felt confident that the monograph collection does indeed speak to sociocultural diversity and presents both scholarly and popular perspectives on identity. However, I did explain to the interns that the personal background of authors is not typically included in our academic library collection development priorities, and that authority may take other shapes more common in academic publishing. I shared that our goal was to see which voices we were elevating or perhaps unwittingly minimizing in our collection, and ideally, other levels of academic writing and publishing systems might also reflect in a similar fashion. We talked about the primary source value of voice and experience, and also how a scholar's area of interest in writing may or may not be influenced by their personal background. They shared with me their perceptions on what elements of diversity matter to them as emerging professionals and scholars, and which might have the most impact for this kind of analysis. We also talked about maybe how collecting practices might integrate these considerations. Next slide. So that being said, here are the student identified elements of diversity that they wanted to investigate, and I'll detail the categories we eventually landed on. First, we had a lot of discussions about gender and sex. Ultimately, we decided to look at gender identity, and they decided to rely on using pronouns and public presentation to inform their selections upon the option of male, female, other, or unknown. We discussed potential misidentifications and how this happens in the real world as well. And we hope that it would all come out in the wash. As with other social science research, errors may counterbalance each other, and findings would even out over thousands of entries. The students took this responsibility for accuracy very seriously. We were also interested in the concepts of race, ethnicity, culture, and nationality, and ultimately decided to break them into 2 fields, with race limited with data validation to create a time-saving dropdown for the 6 U.S. Census race categories to be able to compare findings with demographic statistics available for CCBC students and the county and country at large. To better represent the diversity that enriches our lives, we use the ethnicity/nationality category to include cultural information as people do in everyday life, with the first word reflecting ethnicity and culture and the second word for citizenship or nationality. And that was an entirely complicated issue. This field had no restricted data and became the most difficult field to standardize, which gave me the most concern regarding analysis. To quote one intern, I found a Wikipedia article that discusses that their great-grandfather was Chinese. What do I do with this? I advised the students to use both their social understanding and the concepts they had both luckily recently learned in sociology to make determinations. Sexual orientation was surprisingly difficult to find for the student researchers, and they were reluctant to use context clues, such as photographs of partners, to inform their selection between our restricted data vocabulary of heterosexual, LGBTQ, other, or unknown. Again, the students determined the categories and the elements of diversity. What they were easily able to find, however, was educational attainment. Surprise, surprise. Authors are very likely to be publicly identified with their education levels, but can also be private with other details of their personal lives. The student interns found this to be especially true regarding disability. We had a number of conversations about social media and privacy in the 21st century for both public figures and private individuals, and where authors are in that mix. I loved that they wanted to focus on disability because it was unexpected and not a field in studies that I had seen in the past. And I enjoyed hearing their perspectives on what would qualify using their broad definition informed by the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Department of Labor. And this did ultimately prove to be the most difficult detail to investigate. Moving on finally to the administrative fields, we retained our standard reporting fields to explore perhaps which campuses or subject areas had different strengths in collecting from different groups or voices. Our hypothesis was roughly that our collection's authorship was not as diverse as our student body. Next slide. This project was not without issues, but so many of the conversations that we had were an important part of the process, both for myself and for the students. In the back of my mind, however, it was not how it could be completed or what the data might uncover, but the question of logistics. Could it be done in time? Would it take longer for community college students, newer to structured and sustained research, than it took for graduate students like I had seen in other studies? Were these elements of diversity more time-consuming to reasonably research? As paid interns, the students had to be processed by human resources, which took precious time from the project. The students were not just juggling classes and this internship, but also other jobs and their families, and were often not able to do the full 10 hours every week. Neither intern was able to stay with the project for the 2 consecutive semesters I envisioned. Funding appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared. In the end, as of today, 2 student interns analyzed over 1,300 lines. They averaged 12 minutes per author line of the spreadsheet, and these times varied wildly across authors. Some took 2 minutes, and others had students waiting for responses to emails or social media messages. Students only attempted to directly connect authors when they had exhausted their strategies and on a voluntary basis. Authors, by the way, were uniformly happy to assist the intrepid student investigators. As general advice, my interns advised students taking on this work to trust their gut. After acclimating themselves to the work, they'll know when it's time to give up on certain facets. Scholarly authors tend to be open about their age and educational background, whereas popular authors are likely to share other aspects of themselves. Both students reflected on the difficulty and sometimes uneasiness of labeling others, while also celebrating diversity from so many different kinds of people. Next slide. As I've shared in some detail earlier, I found that attempting to limit your variables with controlled vocabularies could be difficult. The information literacy concepts we teach seek to offer some useful cognitive habits to make decisions in a complex world. And as librarians, I think we hope to inspire curiosity and help students become comfortable with ambiguity. This research was no different in that regard. The options other and unknown were used way more often than we expected. Even using generative AI prompts, we workshopped together. I will be able to continue analysis using various Excel functions like COUNTIF using a wildcard. Regardless of the position of the text, I'll be able to identify the word American, for example. I've just started exploring results with pivot tables to look at intersectionality and relationships in publishing and acquisition between different categories, and how that translates into library acquisition at a community college. Next slide. I'd like to share some of our preliminary findings, just looking at rough percentages and averages for single categories. First, authors were largely male. The students struggled the most with doing their very best to accurately and painstakingly report how authors lived with disabilities, or how many lived with disabilities, and they identified 16% with some physical, mental, or other disability, which I think is eye-opening. When I asked for their recommendations for others looking to do this work, they suggested thinking very carefully about the importance of disability to the local college community before committing to researching. However, they had no doubt that sexual orientation was an absolute must, despite the comparative difficulty of this field. Authors tended to be older, American, and have advanced degrees, which the students understood as expected for our location and the nature of academic attainment and publishing achievement. Anecdotally, students did notice more variation on this theme for works of literature or popular writing. Next slide. I look forward to continuing my analysis with the support of the college's Planning, Research, and Evaluation Department, but the impact of the work is already taking shape here at CCBC because of how engaging in the process has changed my perspective, and it will find a place in our collection development plan as well as the college's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging studies. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final presenter for today is Dr. Chris Hubbard Jackson. Dr. Chris Hubbard Jackson is an educator and author who serves as Dean of Assessment and Institutional Effectiveness at St. Charles Community College in Missouri. She holds a PhD in Educational Leadership and a Master's in Industrial Organizational Psychology. Her research focuses on student success, retention, diversity, equity, and organizational culture. She'll be presenting today on assessing DEI and belonging, from campus realities to actionable insights. Dr. Hubbard Jackson.
Thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. So our outcomes today, participants will learn the importance of campus climate and diversity on DEI and belonging. We will identify effective ways to assess DEI and belonging efforts, and we will gain actionable insights into closing the assessment loop and working towards continuous improvement. So when it comes to assessing anything, you have to deal with the reality of where you are. And what I mean by that is, especially when it comes to DEI, you have to meet people where they are, know where you're starting from, and then know where you're going. So for instance, when we are looking at assessing DEI and belonging, how diverse is your institution and how has that diversity increased or decreased over the past 5 to 10 years? Because if your campus is not that diverse, they may or may not be really that receptive to DEI assessments. How does your institution's diversity compare to the community that it's located in? And you're probably thinking, why is that relevant? Well, I know that at some institutions I've worked, our campus was way more diverse than the community. And then at other institutions, the campus was not as diverse as the community, and one has a way of impacting the other. How receptive is the institution's climate to DEI and belonging efforts? And that climate needs to be checked at the student level as well as the faculty and the staff level, because you cannot expect people who are only willing to do a 100-meter sprint to do a marathon or a relay race with you. It's just unrealistic. And so if you get a real clear idea of where you're starting from, you have a better chance of figuring out how to get where you're going, because it's not like pulling teeth if you have people who really want to go with you on that journey, rather than you having to pull people tooth and nail along the way. And what are you already doing to cultivate DEI and a sense of belonging? So what are the events on your campus? What ways do people feel that sense of belonging? How do they know that your campus is diverse? Like if I walk your campus, what am I going to see? Who am I going to see? You know, have you taken a moment to just walk down the halls of the different buildings? I know at one point, I had a faculty member some years ago ask me about some data. And I said, I'll tell you what, I will help you with your data efforts. I just need you to do one thing for me. And he said, what? I said, go to the first floor of your building, just the first floor, all the way from one end, and walk all the way down to the opposite end and tell me what you see on the walls of your building. When he came to see me, he sat down, he slunk in the chair, and I said, He said, oh, okay. I said, well, tell me what you found. He said, a bunch of white males. I said, oh, Is that all you found? He's like, in a lot of outdated posters. I said, okay, so I'm more than happy to help you, but where are we really? And so that gave he and I a better opportunity to have some really frank conversations to figure out what exactly he really wanted to assess and what he really was trying to do and how feasible that would be with the culture and the climate that we were both existing in. So how are you assessing currently? How are you measuring DEI and belonging? Like, what tools are you using? What are you doing with the results? A lot of people like to give surveys. They like to do focus groups. They're like, surveys are usually the #1 tool for most folks. But what are you doing with the results? Is it just sitting on a shelf somewhere? Let's be honest, we all have collected some information and handed it off, and it kind of went somewhere. And we don't really know, but it's probably sitting on a shelf or on a desk or in a box somewhere. But that's not what we want our efforts to look like. We want our efforts to be actionable. So what can you do with your results? If you take a moment to really sit and think, like, what's feasible here? Like, what can I really do with this information? It'll give you a different perspective rather than, oh, we just collected it and then it's great. And it's like, and then what do you do with it? I was speaking to a colleague the other day who said, okay, well, for our campus events, we collect student attendance. And I said, and that is great. And what does that tell you? He said, well, it tells us the numbers of students who attended. And I said, and that's great. And what does that tell you? He said, it tells me the number of students who attended. And I said, and that's great. What can you do with that information? He was like, well, I know that students are attending. I said, do you? Do you know why they're attending or not? Do you know which events have better attendance than others? Do you know if it's because someone offered extra credit, or if it was the time of day, or if it was that particular speaker, or if it was that particular topic? Do you really know? And he said, well, I guess I don't. And I said, okay. So once again, you know who's in the seats, which is great because that's great for budgeting reasons. But do you know why they're there? And do you know how they were impacted? And so having that real conversation about what he wanted to do with the results helped to revise his assessment plan. It helped him to figure out how to revise his survey and to really get a full and, fuller understanding of what exactly he was collecting the information for. Because far too long, people like to collect information, which is great. And they check the box. Oh, we've done assessment. That's great. But then what, right? Then what? So here are some common tools that you can use for measuring DEI and belonging. The SRC has some components on it, and it's more focused on student engagement, but it does have some components. The SRC is the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. The Sense of Social Fit Scale has some information in it that is also useful. The HEEDS Diversity, Equity, Campus Climate Survey, it has been useful. The HARRY Diverse Learning Environment Survey, I know as my campus has actually implemented that one, as well as the SRC. And we got to a point where we just created our own, because there are just some instances where you really do want to ask specific questions. And if you're going to ask your specific questions and create your own, begin with your end goal in mind. What exactly are you trying to find out, and what are you going to do with it? So some good questions to ask would be, why did you attend this event? What did you like most? What did you like least? How has this event impacted how you feel about DEI and belonging? How has this event impacted your sense of belonging? What can this institution do to improve your sense of belonging here? But being very specific, you can take that data and actually use it rather than just saying 50 students came. They had donuts. We talked about some stuff. We think they felt involved. Let's do a little bit more than that. So closing the loop on assessment is the most important thing that you can do when it comes to measuring DEI and belonging. And the reason closing the assessment loop is the most important is because if you collect information but don't do anything with it, students will get wind of that and they will stop sharing their thoughts because they feel like, what's the point? Nothing ever changes. Nothing is going to happen, right? They're like, why should I share with you my input? Why should I take your survey when you don't value my input? And people need to visibly see the change. If they can't visibly put their finger on something, then they don't exactly trust the process, and you want people to trust the process. So closing the loop is vital. So what will you change based on this assessment? You know, once you've given out your assessment and you figured out where people are and how they feel about things, what will you change? What can you change? What are your end goals? Like, what exactly are you working towards here? Because let's face it, you can have something, you can assess it, but what are you trying to do? What are you working towards? Collect actionable data and use the results. Because if you collect data that isn't actionable, once again, if you collect just how many students attended an event, that's great. You know how many students to budget for. But how does that really move the needle on what's going on your campus? How does that really move the needle on how your students feel or how your faculty and staff feel? Like, there has to be a bit more there. And speaking of faculty and staff, the faculty and staff in your institution help to determine the pulse of your institution. So it is mission critical that in addition to looking at student DEI and belonging, you also look at faculty staff DEI and belonging, because those are the folks who are supporting the students, right? And so if they're not feeling included, if they're not feeling welcome, if they're not feeling that sense of belonging, they can't give that nurturing to the students or support to the students. So it's mission critical that we make sure that our faculty and our staff are feeling that support. So in closing, if you feed them, they will come. When they come, ask them. And once you know what they've had to say, then you must do something. Closing the loop is essential. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And oh, it was wonderful. We made a great time. We have a lot of, I guess we have questions from participants.
So at this point, there was only one question in there, which we would like to answer again. Yes, the recording of this event will be available. It is going to go onto the ACRL YouTube, so all can see it and it can be shared. If you have other questions, you can type them into the Q&A and we can ask our panelists. I want to give attendees first crack because I've got some that I'd like to ask myself. So is there an attendee who would like to go first? Well, while they type, here's one of my questions. And this is a question to all of our wonderful panelists here today. What are some of the best or most creative results of DEIA assessment that you've witnessed? I don't know who wants to go first. I see you all thinking about it.
I can
Dr.
dive
Bright?
in. I can jump in. Yeah. I think for me, the most creative one I saw was I did an assessment with the library that really had no sense of why they were struggling with retention of their faculty of color. They kept saying, oh, they're leaving for positions because it was a better opportunity. And I'm like, I doubt it was a better opportunity. And there were other things to consider. They actually heeded the analysis, though, that we did. We did an assessment of the organization, and they went to their provost and they requested funding to do a cluster hire, because one of the concerns they had was bringing in a single person who had no support. And they were actually able to hire 3 people to come in, and the roles were not just specifically DEIA based, but the idea was that they had a focus on DEIA within the work, and it was so important that they had each other there as well. And they realized that that was one of the very bigger barriers they had. So to me, the fact that they went to the provost and they got very creative with the one position they were supposed to have. They had one position, and they really were able to lobby with the report that I gave them and also the information they had to be able to create that cluster hire. And to me, it was the most important thing they could have done to really help them figure out how to get over that hump that helped support their retention.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add? Oh, Dr.
So
Hubbard Jackson?
similar to that, but not exactly the same. An article that I did some research and wrote is navigating the impact of the community on the community college. And we were having some difficulty hiring diverse faculty and staff and keeping them. I mean, there was like a 18-month countdown. Like you could tell in their eyes that they were not here for it within 18 months. And in doing the research that I did, I actually spoke to a number of people across different institutions in the United States and found out that people are not being forthcoming about what's really going on their campuses. You know, when I was hired at my institution, I work at a PWI. I knew coming in that based on the county and the experience that I had, you know, growing up and what it was, I knew coming in the door that it might just be me. And I had to be okay with that. However, what I was finding is when we were hiring other people, they would put people like me and a few other folks on the committee, which gave the perception of there being more than like 5 of us on the campus. And when people would get here, they would really truly get the feel for it. And so basically just figuring out, just, you know, be honest with where things are on your campus. Like that is a super important thing, because you will not be able to retain people if you do not just put your cards on the table. Like how you can quickly get away from here is not a selling point. You know, like we are 2 hours away from whatever. No, that's not a selling point. However, you know, we have we don't have traffic. Good selling point. Family friendly community. Good selling point. Low crime. Good selling point. Diverse places of worship. Good selling points. And so just really being honest about where your institution is very helpful.
Elizabeth, is there anything that you would like to add?
These are fantastic examples, and I can't even begin to say that any of these things would even I think we're at a very privileged position at CCBC with an incredibly diverse staff that really does match and reflect our diverse student body. And so I do think that the institution was quicker to jump on this sort of assessment before the library eventually it trickled down to us. And so our first thought reflectively was to look at the services we provide and the collection we offer, rather than staffing issues, hoping that the college itself would resolve those issues with its own assessment. But I'm really glad to see that it's worked out for other institutions.
Well, that actually leads us into our next question from our attendees, and it is specifically for you, Elizabeth. In terms of analyzing titles, how would this impact the library on changing collection strategies for the collection?
I mean, it's a good question, and it's not something that I did mention that I was a practitioner of library arts, and I mean that because I'm not a practitioner of library sciences. I don't think it's a science, collection development, that is. And so I think reflecting on what we teach our students, that authority is constructed. This sort of big concept, this old framework now, it's 10 years old framework, that we really do think about the audience of who we're collecting. So we're not just collecting on subject, but we might also just be collecting voices and stories that we might not even prioritize. And we talked about some of my other my co-presenters mentioned the limitations that come with a single perspective. And a lot of times our collections are driven. Sure, we get support from faculty, and librarians contribute to varying levels at different institutions to collection development, but oftentimes it comes down to one person. And so loosening that up and going out of your way, if you're in that role, and certainly if you're in a directorial role, to make sure that multiple perspectives are there to define what the institution's collecting priorities are. That may be just reflecting and closely tailoring to the academic programming at an institution limits the what the library can ultimately do for the college community and the community that surrounds it. So I hope that answers that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Linda Miles. Linda asks, if we are hoping to assess a specific program or initiative, do you have any insight about how to include consideration of DEIA? For example, a specific textbook affordability initiative or a specific workshop series? What are your suggestions? Anyone would like to go first?
I'll
That's
kickstart
right.
us off. Yeah, I'll start us off. First thing I'll say is that some of this needs to go into your planning, and that'll help you immensely. So if you are, before you even start planning a workshop series, you're actually conducting a needs assessment analysis of everyone in the organization to see what needs to be covered in that workshop series and what topics, and that's going to help you later when you're also then assessing the impact of the workshop series. So what did you learn? How are you going to apply it? That type of thing. We struggle a lot with collecting demographic information from people who come to our sessions because people aren't always interested in providing that information for fear of how it's going to be used. And that's just being honest. I just completed an assessment today from the UNC system asking me lots of questions about the climate here. And I'm looking at all the demographics going, yes, once you add these together, you know who I am, because I am one of a few who exist. But there is a need for us to at least acknowledge that when we ask people for that information, that we are collecting demographic information because we understand that some people are adversely impacted by XYZ, and we hope that you will provide that information. So give them a reason for why you're collecting the data, and people are more willing to give you the information. And then especially if you're talking about textbook affordability, asking questions about socioeconomic status, asking questions along the lines of whether or not you have additional support in the household, even asking questions along the lines of, can you even get to the library? All those questions are actually really relevant and valid and can be asked, as a way to assess your textbook affordability programming. And you're not even necessarily asking the traditional questions that people assume we need to ask related to DEIA. You don't necessarily need to know what someone's race ethnicity is to know that they're having trouble affording textbooks in college. Plain and simple. So it's one of those things where if you're pre-planning for something like a workshop series, ask all the questions beforehand, do the analysis, do the focus groups, ask people what they need. If you're talking about something that's already in place, it's okay to ask demographic questions. Just let people know why you're asking and how you're going to use that information.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add? They're both looking like that spoke volumes. Okay. All right. We can move on to the next question. This is a question by our attendee, Carl Andrews. What does DEI assessment look like when 90% of the students are of color and are from traditionally underrepresented groups?
I think I can take
Dr.
this
Jackson?
one. So the short answer is dig deeper. Dig deeper. So within everybody's community, we all have subcultures and sub-communities. Everyone's intersectionality, once you put them together, you're going to find more. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. I have a friend of mine. On paper, we could be very similar people, but if you have a conversation with us, the lived experiences that we have will let you know that she is here and I am there, and we are not having the same experience. We went to undergrad, I finished, she did something else. Because we were not having the same experience, and we, grew up together from the same place, but we were not having the same lived experience. So dig deeper. Do not just stop at the surface level. Don't get comfortable sticking to things like race, ethnicity, gender, marital status, age. Keep going. Ask more pointed questions. Dig deeper.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbard Jackson. Any other insights on that particular question?
Just to build on that as well, because what Dr. Hubbard Jackson is really saying here is that each of us in our cultures are not a monolith. We are. So I can easily put on paper that I am an African-American female, and so can someone else. But if you sit us next to each other, we may not look anything alike, which means that our experiences may not be anything similar to each other. I grew up with parents who my father is very light, blue-eyed. My mother is very dark, and I'm the mixes up in a bowl and this is what you get, right? The person in the middle. They talk about their experiences growing up in the 50s and 60s. And my mom's experience as a very dark Black woman and my father's experience as a very light Black man are not the same, but they're both Black people who grew up in the south of the United States. So you definitely want to recognize that even if we're marking the same boxes, we don't necessarily all fit into those boxes as defined by someone else. And we may not necessarily identify ourselves that way. So definitely what Dr. Hubbard Jackson said, ask them a little bit more for their context, and don't use those identity markers that we need for so many things as a way to define who they are, because they may not actually apply. And you may wind up putting people into a box that they don't fit into.
Thank you very much. So we have just one more question. This is from our attendee. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, Stacy Rolston Wieland. I think the question is more so geared towards Elizabeth Godwin, but all can obviously include their individual ideas. Stacy writes, I think assessing the catalog for diversity in this manner is excellent. Is there a plan for what to do with this information after it is collected? Possibly a committee to curate a collection to meet gaps?
I think all the panelists talked about the importance of acting upon your assessment and closing that loop. And I think from the very beginning, that was part of the plan. It wasn't ever designed to just be a practice. However beneficial the practice itself and the process itself was incredibly beneficial, but the idea is to really reflect, and certainly it will be something that now that I've been elevated to the position of director of the libraries, will have an impact in strategic planning. Will have an impact perhaps in linking up the library with the college's very strong diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging activities. And a committee on creating curated collections is not a bad idea at all. I think there are a lot of voices that we, within our own institutional brain trust, our faculty and staff, that we don't typically ask for collection development input. There are insights that we need to bring more people in terms of collecting in the library. And I think this is an opportunity for us to critique our own standard practices so that we can see something in the future. And starting off with those base numbers is an absolute necessity for us to understand what our normal is and what the collecting development textbooks tell us to do. And we all create collection development policies that basically mimic each other's. And so this is giving us a perspective and a benchmark, a North Star to build on for growth. And so I think we're going to move down that road and hopefully take more opportunities to directly include and invite people into collection development.
Wonderful, wonderful, and wonderfully said as well. Dr. Bright, Dr. Hubbard Jackson, is there anything else you? Okay. Well, that was our, oh, wait, I see something else just popped into the Q&A. Oh, this was a comment from, I apologize again if I mispronounce your name, Bernice Sufal. To above question, our bibliographic data, authority control, and subject headings really doesn't reflect diversity. At my college, we have to include local notes and include this information in LibGuides for students to search catalog materials that reflect diversity, education, and diverse authors. I really understand where each of you are coming from with that statement too. Dr. Someone just unmuted. Oh.
I got a thought. We're actually paying, and it could be a wonderful byproduct of this study. We've been doing this project for more than a year, but we've ultimately decided with the cataloging team to Outsource, outsource all of that. We are updating absolutely everything. And this is a serious financial commitment, but it's work that is good work and it needs to be done. So you might end up in the same position that we are, looking back on our historic acquisitions that were certainly cataloged from a different perspective using different vocabularies. We don't have the staff, and I'm sure a lot of other libraries are in the same position. We don't have the staff to look backwards. We can only look forwards. And so we've made the decision to prioritize updating everything. We're only as good as our catalog. Thanks.
Very well said.
At my institution, I know things are updated on an ad hoc basis, and there is a plan to update things, going forward. But I think some things, if it has more, if it's visibly seen more or checked out more or accessed more, it gets more attention. Our librarians are actually very deliberate about showcasing specific genres of books and certain topics. Usually every month they have a different women's history, so you'll have a theme that goes with that. And of course, February there's a theme, and January, so every month has a theme. And then we have a book club that also highlights more of the diverse authors, and just trying to really just get people more aware with that. So I do think, Elizabeth, you all investing in that is absolutely amazing and awesome, because it does help when people can find what they're looking for and don't have to go through like, okay, is this it, or I'm not sure. So that's really awesome.
And I'll briefly add that even though I can't speak for all LIS programs, I do know that at least here at ECU and a lot of our neighboring programs, we are better preparing our students to do this work and to think about this. So when they get into the field, it's not something that they're unable to accomplish, that it actually is part of their mindset. So they may come in and start doing work as a cataloger and automatically thinking we need to start adding these local notes because we don't have that information. So we are at least trying to prepare the next generation so that this doesn't become just we're doing backlog work all the time, but that at least, as you were saying, Elizabeth, going forward, the work is automatically being done. It's built into their process.
The comment was also followed up. There is not enough funding to sometimes outsource as well. We all know that. It also involves all librarians coming on board to select materials that represent diverse voices in any subject discipline. I know our education librarian does a phenomenal job on this goal, but we need more buy-in. I definitely agree with that. I think all of the information we've gotten from our wonderful presenters is truly going to go a long way. I know it has stirred lots of my own thinking on how we can improve our DEI assessment process here at my own college. It's 3:58. I don't see any more questions.